Welcome, everybody. This is terrific. I'm Margaret Mills. I had the great pleasure to be working with John Roberts, both at the University of Pennsylvania of sainted memory and also Ohio State University, and got to see some of his exploits besides that, but there's more, and we will hear about them. He was, as you probably know, a former president of AFS. He was also deputy chair of NEH. He was Dean of Arts and Humanities at OSU, and I want to say that a folklorist makes a terrific dean, so think in those terms, y'all. And he was also Dean of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Houston. He chaired African-American Studies at OSU. I'm reading all this because it's a long list. He was also Associate Professor of Folklore and Folklife at Penn and Director of the African-American Studies program there. And his books include From Trickster to Badman, Black Folk Hero in Slavery and Freedom, and From Hucklebuck to Hip Hop, Social Dance in the African American Community in Philadelphia. He's also an AFS Fellow, and I want to thank both the AFS Collecting Memories Oral History Project and the Fellows for putting us on the program today. So without too much more formality, I wanted to just prompt John with a few questions and see if we can get him to do a monologue, a long one. I guess our first question is, how did you choose or find folklore studies? What's your origin story in the discipline?
Well, first of all, good morning to everybody, and thank you for coming. Well, I was an English major as an undergraduate, and I'd gotten a master's degree in English, and when I came to OSU to do my PhD, I was kind of Englished out, and I was looking for other kinds of courses to take. And Pat Mullen happened to offer a course in, I'll always remember, American folk song. And I signed up for the class, and it was a sort of a survey of American folk song. And one of the things I discovered that on the syllabus was a section on the spirituals and on the blues, and the way Pat taught the course, he talked a lot about the intersections of Americans' music and the influence of different traditions on each other and so forth. And the thing that struck me about it was that there was this class and there was this field that was really interested in things that I knew from my own experience. You know, I grew up in the South where people still sang the spirituals. They were part of every Sunday morning's church service, etc. And certainly in school, as going to an all-Black school in the South, one of the things the chorus did all the time, the school chorus, was to sing spirituals, the more ranged versions of them, but spirituals nonetheless. And the radio, if you heard anything on the radio in the South at that time, it was probably the blues. I remember a program as a kid on the radio that came on every afternoon. It was called Red, Hot, and Blue. And that was the only program at that time that actually featured a lot of Black music. There's a lot of the music that you know, Pat was talking about in the class, I actually experienced myself. And so I became really fascinated by this fact that there was something coming out of my own experience that was of interest to scholars, and that I could actually do this. And that was beside the fact that I was tired of Shakespeare and Chaucer and all of these other writers that I had studied too many times. And so I started to talk to Pat about, you know, opportunities in the field and so forth. And that's kind of how I got into it. It was not easy at Ohio State because although they had folklore, they only had Pat as a full-time professor of folklore at that time. Dan Barnes taught folklore classes every once in a while, and so did Francis Utley. And I was really excited about taking the class with Utley, but the semester that I had an opportunity, he was away the first year I was there. And when I had an opportunity to take a class with him, he had scheduled a class, he passed away before the class ever began. So I missed that opportunity, but I worked with Pat very extensively because we didn't have a lot of coursework. It was a lot of individualized study. with him. But that's how I got into the field.
Okay, well, I want to insert one piece of Robert's folklore at this point. I think Jessica's going to help us by putting up the document. This is John Roberts' mom's banana pudding recipe, you all. So get out your pencils. Here we go. It's 3/4 of a cup of sugar, 2 cups of milk, 4 egg yolks, some vanilla, you got to decide how much, vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, maybe 2, and 4 egg whites beaten as for meringue. So you cook the custard over boiling water until it's thickened. You layer sliced bananas and vanilla wafers into a buttered, I think, baking dish. Whip the egg whites as meringues with a little sugar in them. Top the pudding with the meringue and broil it gently to brown it. And I want to say this is amazing, amazing banana pudding. I didn't even think I liked bananas, but this made my world. So that's folklore, right? And that's from John's mom. So besides that nugget, the other thing I wanted to ask John at this point was whether he would tell us what was the most fun that you've had as a folklorist. I realize we're going to get to more serious stuff, so but let's start with this.
Somehow I've lost everybody.
You did? Oh, I can see you.
Okay, I guess we have to accept that I can't figure out how to get back up my picture back.
Most fun you've had, give or take.
I think the most fun I had was the time that you and I chaired the program committee
Yeah.
for AFS. It was it was a lot of work. I recall a lot of frantic times. The most interesting part was not knowing the place that we were holding the meeting. I think it was in Lafayette that year, in Louisiana. And I recall that on the way to that trip, I was director of African-American Studies at Penn at that time. And I got my secretary to make my reservations. And it was not until I got to Chicago on the way to Lafayette that I discovered that I had been scheduled not for Lafayette, Louisiana, but Lafayette, Indiana. And, and I had to make a late, I was supposed to get there the first day of the afternoon because Ernest Gaines, the writer, was doing a presentation that night, that evening, and I was supposed to introduce him. And so it certainly turned out that there was no way I was going to do that. And trying to get a flight to get to Lafayette, of course, my luggage did not come with me. So I arrived in Lafayette without any luggage, having to do I was on the board at that time, AFS board, and had a board meeting the next morning, first thing. And so I went in smelling very fresh. But it was the funniest thing. Everybody thought it was the funniest story in the world. And so I decided that it wasn't real frustration, it was fun. I think it was probably the most fun I've had as a folklorist.
That's an amazing idea of fun. Gee, from there, what would you say was the most problematic or challenging experience you've had as a folklorist? Kind of, if that wasn't it, I mean, if there were others.
Well, I think the most challenging thing I did was chairing the, I forget what the committee was called, but at the time we were trying to develop sort of a minority action plan. It's just the same issue that came up yesterday of trying to recruit more minorities to the field. And we were working with this organization called the Fund for Folk Culture. They were funding the activities of this committee at the time. And we were meeting in a lot of different places at that point. And trying to work out, try to come up with a plan which would increase the minority participation in the field was an incredible challenge. I mean, I don't know whatever happened with the plan. I don't have a copy of it anymore, but it was, I mean, I think it's a continuing challenge for the field to try and figure out how you do that. And I think the people who are working on some of the same issues now feel the same way. That, but I think that's, I don't know what to say about it except that it was a challenge.
Yeah, ongoing. I forgot to mention at the outset, if you have comments, questions, please put them in chat and we'll get them circulated to John in due time. We've got plenty of time for Q&A here. So if you have comments, questions, put them up in chat. Okay, yeah, I could. The other thing, I don't know if any of you have experienced John's administrative gifts. Well, you will have because we were all members of AFS, but he's just an astounding administrator, very effective. I think it has to do with listening, among other things. But I wondered too, what was the most fun, or the most satisfying, not so much fun, but the most satisfying time that you've had as a program administrator, because you've administered a lot of things, starting from African-American studies, and also you didn't mention, but you were also for a while chair of folklore and folklife before you went to Ohio State, I believe. But that was minor compared to all the other stuff on that list.
No, I didn't do that one.
Oh, great.
I did African American and African Studies at Ohio State. I think my time at Ohio State was probably the most fulfilling. You know, we were in, it was a very challenging time because we were in the middle of this transition from being 5 individual colleges of arts and science to becoming a college of arts and sciences. But at the time, the deans of the 5 colleges were fairly autonomous. And I went into that position with one of the goals that people really embraced was the idea of diversifying the faculty. And we had, I think, phenomenal success, not only in diversifying the faculty on the Columbus campus, but even the regional campuses, which we are not allowed to call regional campuses because that's why it's the Ohio State University, because there's only one university. But I remember the idea that we came up with, you know, not only did we put a great deal of emphasis on the recruitment of diverse faculty members, but there was this plan that we came up with that was very successful. It was very helpful in achieving the goals that we set for ourselves. And it happened sort of serendipitously. One of the chairs came in one day with they had identified a candidate that they wanted to make an offer to, but we started talking, and the chair was talking about how difficult it had been to make a decision because they had 2 candidates in the pool that they thought were highly qualified, and they were very excited about both. And it was a shame that they could not hire both. And I thought about it for a while, and you know, did the work that I needed to do with my budget people and everything, and we decided that, well, why not? Let's make offers to both of those people. And this became a trend across the college. If departments were able to identify more than one highly qualified person for a position, a minority candidate for a position, we would simply make offers to both of those people. Sometimes we got both, sometimes we did not. But it really sort of expedited the achievement of the goals that we had set in that arena. I think the other thing that I was really pleased about at Ohio State was the improvement in faculty salaries that we were able to effect during the time that I was there. One of the problems in most merit systems is that is the way in which the rewards compensation is really awarded. And it usually goes to people who are most productive in the most valued area of faculty work, and that's usually a scholarship. And we were able to develop metrics that allowed us to sort of break that down in different ways. I don't want to go into all the specifics of it, nor can I remember them all. But I remember that that faculty salaries became much more equitable, I think, under the system that we were using. We almost never had a complaint about the amount of somebody's raise or the way in which we arrived at it. And I thought that was a great achievement. I think one of the things that for me personally as an administrator, wherever I was, is the ability to make the kind of changes that you think are important in the context of whatever it is you're doing, whether it's dean or deputy chairman or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And by the same token, I was thinking I may be wrongly thinking of challenging as problematical, but I wondered what the most problematical or challenging time was in your administrative lifetime. Where did the, where were the walls, or what were the major obstacles or major?
Well, I mean, I think that from the time I went to Penn for the rest of my career, I was always doing something administrative. And doing administration and doing faculty at the same time is very challenging because the bar on the faculty side is never lowered. I mean, what it takes to get tenure, whether you're doing administration or whether you're doing a straight faculty appointment, it never changes. And I think that was the most frustrating thing for me, was to figure out how was I going to do the administrative things that I enjoyed and at the same time get tenure and get promotion and so forth. So I found that sometimes very difficult to negotiate those two roles. And that was, as I said, it was sometimes somewhat frustrating. But I mean, one of the things that I discovered was that that it's really I'll bring up Kenneth Goldstein, I'll put it that way. One of the things I appreciated about being at Penn at the time that I was there was Kenneth Goldstein and his willingness to make allowances, or make it not allowances so much as it was, to make it easier for me to do what I needed to do as a faculty member, even though he had nothing to do with my decision to take on administrative roles at that time. He understood that in order for me to be fulfilled as a faculty member, that it was important for me to do these things, and that as the administrator, the lead of the department, the academic department that I was in, it was up to him to facilitate it. And I remember at the point that I became most frustrated in trying to write From Trickster to Badman. And I was talking to Kenny about how I didn't have the time, et cetera, doing the teaching and the administration and everything. And he told me that it's only Kenny could say it. Well, you take the semester off. And said, how do I do that? He said, I just told you, you do that. and it just sort of like opened up the world for me, that I'm not gonna have to run back and forth from class trying to find time to do this research and this writing. I'm gonna have some time to do it. And it really helped a lot. But I find that, but that was gonna become a continuing thing. But one of the things about just doing the scholarship side of being a faculty member is that once you get started, it becomes much easier. Trickster Badman was the first major thing that I actually tried to work on. The first thing that I had, no faculty guidance or anything And so getting that done was extremely important, and the whole thing relieved a lot of the frustration of doing it.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. I mean, to take the kind of meta statement here, I mean, you too, when you were deaning at OSU, were extremely good at figuring out, as you said, how to be equitably aware of different faculty contributions of research, teaching, and admin service, and trying to take account of that. And it really, I was by that time running a department that had a variety of actors in it, and it was really helpful to have that understanding of balance in people's roles. And Kenny, of course, was an amazing advocate, I think, for a lot of us. Advocacy and balance might be the things here. And you know, hoping for a long maintenance of productivity and presence in whatever you're trying to run. Yeah.
Chime in, Margaret, with a related question, if I could do so. I'm trying to mind the chat for you here. Well, Marilyn White has a series of questions that maybe we can get to in a moment, but while we're talking about administration, Kate Parker Horrigan from Western Kentucky asks, as an experienced administrator, what advice do you have for academic folklore programs in the current climate of budget cuts to higher ed generally and humanities in particular?
Well, I think budget cuts are always challenging. It depends on how the budget is being cut, I guess, would influence how you can sort of think about this. But whew, that's a real tough one. I think that one of the things that anytime the budgets, you go into a budget cutting situation, it means that one of the things that units have to do is to focus more directly on priorities, to figure out what is the most important thing for the unit to be doing at that particular time, and to figure out how do you maneuver budgetary resources in a way that you're able to still achieve your priorities. If the priority is to hire people, then it means that some other things are probably going to have to take a back seat to you're coming up with the resource to do it. I think the other thing is to work with the higher administration to make sure that your specific needs, especially in the area of faculty hiring and that kind of thing, are being taken into consideration when budget cuts are being made. I think that one of the things that especially departments are reluctant to do is to sometimes go into the dean and say, you know, look, I know we have to cut the budget, but is there any room for this particular department? Because you have to understand that the person that you're reporting to probably has a number of other departments that may have more flexibility than you do. I've certainly, in my experience, worked with departments sometimes to achieve certain goals in times of, you know, financial straits, to make sure that they were able to do something that was important for the maintenance of the quality of the teaching and research in that particular unit. You know, as an administrator, you have to make those kinds of calculations at times, and you can do it. But never underestimate the possibility of getting relief, if not, if you can't make it for yourself, to get it from the people to whom the person whom you're reporting to. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, apropos of that, Dory Noyes just stepped in here. We need to go back to Marilyn's questions too, but Dory says, can I tell my favorite John in the Dean's office story? This might be directly pertinent to what you were just saying about protecting resources. Dory, are you there?
We in fact have many memories of John's ability to do miracles. But I was thinking of a moment one of those moments of budget cuts. We were having a chairs and directors meeting, and we were all sitting around a seminar table. And the chair of philosophy was giving this long diatribe about one of John's plans to increase faculty research support or something. I don't remember what it was, but he, went into this lyrical vision of what it would be if the faculty had all of this support, and how, we would transform everybody's life. It was such a beautiful dream. John, what happened to that dream? And without missing a beat, John said, deferred. And Valerie Lee, the chair of English, professor of African American literature, started quietly breaking, 20% of the room actually got what you had said, but I have never.
Oops, your sound blew out on us.
It was a great moment. So, most deans pretty soon, behind their cool facade, they get this look in their eyes, or a look of soulless vampirism or something. Most deans give indicators of honest, but somehow John managed at least occasionally to enjoy the job.
Maybe this is a good time to turn to Marilyn's questions too, because they're pretty pertinent about keeping the elders, including John, on the field at AFS, and why and how come that's hard to do, or has been hard to do. Marilyn, do you want to unmute yourself and say what you said? If you can see her chat as well.
Thanks so much. And this is so wonderful and so great to see so many colleagues who are here for this. John, we have seriously missed you at AFS. And I'm wondering when you stepped away, why you stepped away, what's brought you back, will you keep coming back, and what do we need to do to make sure that folks don't step away, that we keep folks, whether they're retired or not, because we've lost permanently or temporarily some folks who we just don't see anymore. So what do we need to, what does AFS need to do or think about in terms of keeping folks or bringing them back into the fold? Thank you.
Well, to begin at the beginning, I did not intend to step away. It's other things kind of took me away. I think that shortly after I stepped down as president of AFS, I had the opportunity to go to Washington and serve as deputy chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities for a couple of years. I think before that, I was a department chair. And it always seemed at those times that there was something always interfering with, my ability to get to the meetings and so forth. I mean, I certainly think that at Ohio State, and even at Houston to a certain extent, I remained involved with, the department and the work that they were doing in various ways. But it's very difficult when you are a full-time administrator to also remain actively engaged in all of the other kinds of academic activities that you were engaged in prior to taking that on. And so that was a problem. In my case, it just seems that the things that were most urgent for me were not at AFS meetings, but someplace else or so forth. I've been wanting to get back and actively involved since I retired about 5 years ago. But I don't know, everything happened. 1 year I was getting ready to go and my mother became seriously ill. The next year she passed away, and things like that start to happen to you. And then you get kind of relaxed in retirement and you don't really want to be bothered with much of anything other than retirement. The kind of things that, the thing that brought me back this year was the Utley panel and the opportunity to speak about some things that I really still cared about, and realized that once it was brought to me that it was. And I think that I would still be involved if there was really something that was of particular interest to me about that was going on, that people felt that I could be of help in making happen, or to help think through, or whatever. And so I don't think that in my case, or probably in the case of most people, that there was any sort of deliberation about, okay, I'm not going to be involved with folklore or the AFS anymore. It just sort of happens, you know, things start to happen in life. And the further you get away from something, the more difficult it seems to get back. And if you're not paying attention, it becomes even more difficult. And I think that that's what happened with me. And I think it's what happened to a lot of people. I think if we were hearing from the society more often, even though we may not have active memberships and so forth, I think that would be very helpful in making sure that we remained engaged with what was going on. When Marcia Gade contacted me, you know, I was really surprised. And when she talked about what she had in mind, I was really delighted. And so, I mean, it's the need to, I guess, sort of the outreach would also be helpful, I think, in keeping people who have sort of been disengaged, engaged a lot better.
Yeah, this is a nice segue to the next couple of things on my list, but I want to say from the panel yesterday, I felt like I was getting a lesson that I should have had 30 or 40 years ago in that strong a form, and that I could still maybe aspire to being educated by it. It was really just, you guys did such a brilliant job. And however that kind of education of the likes of me could continue, you know, would be, and later groups of folklorists as well, we just really, really need that voicing at various levels. I mean, this was a premier, incredible performance for all three of you, but we just need that energy all the time. And I don't know how fair it is to ask you of it, or ask our very small contingent of folklorists of color to be doing that, but just your presence certainly gave us quite a wake-up call yesterday. The us I'm using is the us that really needed to hear that kind of remedially, I could say. And I wondered in that context if you want to add specifically to folklorists of color who are with us or who might join us, you know, what do you want to say above and beyond, or in addition to what was said yesterday, that we might need to hear, that everybody might need to hear?
Well, I think the question that we were able to entertain yesterday, you know, I've been thinking about it since the young man asked the question about how do we get more people involved. I think as everybody said, it's a real challenge because for lots of reasons, and part of it is the lack of exposure on the part of a lot of people to exactly what it is that folklore does, or what the potential is for doing a lot more, and the kind of questions that really could be raised within the context of folklore. I don't think that you know, a lot of times, especially students of color are really sort of presented with the challenge, the challenging questions that the field grapples with all the time, you know, like the one on racism, the issue of racism, et cetera, and how folklore can actually address that in different ways. I mean, I think yesterday we were probably more in the critical mode of the field in terms of racism. But I think there are other, you know, more dynamic ways of approaching that issue. Racism is not just something that affects the field and what we do and how we do it, but it's also something that affects minority communities in terms of the kind of folklore that they're producing, and how do we actually deal with those kinds of things. But I think that, by inserting more language in course descriptions and so forth, that helps students understand that, yeah, these are questions. I think one of the crucial ones that Prahlad and I especially been talking about in the course of thinking about this panel and so forth is the whole issue of race. When we talk about culture all the time, and I think that's very appropriate, of course, but students don't understand that there really is in the Western, in our country anyway, and perhaps much of Western society, there's very little room between race and culture. There's a kind of intersection there that students need to understand. And there are issues like that I think we need to think about the broader audience when we are framing course descriptions that we're going to publicize about the courses that we teach. Because this is where we're going to get students only pretty much is through our courses and what our courses promise. You don't have to devote the whole class to those kinds of issues, but we need to talk more openly, I think, about those kinds of things. Well, yeah, I mean, that's some ideas I was thinking about after the meeting yesterday, and the question that the student asked and how some of the ways we can, because we really don't want to turn students off, because I don't think the field is going to make the kinds of changes and additions, et cetera, that we were talking about yesterday, unless we diversified the folks who are doing the work. And right now, it is not a particularly diverse field. And sometimes the feeling of being the only one or one of the few turns people off. But sometimes it's a very good place to begin.
Yeah, I was thinking as you spoke, and yesterday I was thinking about Professor Prahlad when he was saying, so you got, I'm summarizing, I hope accurately, so there's lots and lots of work on minority and marginal folks, but where's the work on white folklore? And I was thinking, well, there's a lot of banana pudding recipe type stuff, to use an example, that's out there. And I'm not denigrating people doing family and local folkways. But what I heard him to be saying, and I hope I'm right, is that why are we not using our capacity to study the folklore of whiteness, of the fish in the water, the analogy he brought up? Is it, that made my head whip around. And yeah, and that can be put in a syllabus in a way that's kind of a stealth thing, like, the ways of considering identity. It doesn't have to be something that's gonna engage with our current social problems it doesn't have to advertise them, but it certainly will engage with them. And I guess that was the last question I had on my list, is whether you have words for us for the current socio-political conditions. How should we be out there in this extremely polarized and scary kind of institutional and social environment that we're looking at?
Yeah, interesting. I mentioned a book yesterday and toward the end of my talk, because I think it's one of the best things I've read in a very long time. And that is the book that I mentioned, White Fragility, Why White People Don't Want to Talk About Race. And it's written by a white woman who works as a diversity trainer. For people, some of you may have already read it. But and one of the things that always happened with her was, of course, they would have these contracts and so forth to go in and do diversity training at different kinds of institutions. And her role was usually to talk with the white people about diversity. And she said that her experience was, you walk into a room and you ask people about what do they know about racism, what has been their experience with it. And almost immediately people, this is with the fragility of it, it sort of froze up. And most of them would say things like, well, I don't really know very much about it. I don't know anything about it. And so the conversation would pretty much, if you stop there, the conversation pretty much ends before it ever gets going. And that becomes a part of the problem. And I think that, one of the things that really is always helpful, if you speak the words, I mean, there is no way that you live in American society and you don't know anything about race or racism. You may not like what you know. You may not be able to articulate what you know and what you feel about it, but you know something about it. And it's because we really don't study it. And, the whole idea one of the ideas I was trying to articulate yesterday, also at the end of it, is this whole notion that the people who are most empowered to do something about racism, quite often in this society, seems to be the people who are least interested in doing anything, the people who have power. And so you get all of these people who are out in the streets marching because they don't have the power to do anything. And then they get vilified and so forth. But, we have to, for those of us who really care about these kinds of things, we're really interested in equality and equity and those kinds of issues. The Brianna kind of thing, speak it. I mean, you got to speak it out loud. You got to be willing to say it. And, the idea of studying whiteness in the context of folklore is not, we've studied Blackness forever because that's been one of the most asked questions since the entry of African people into this society is, who are they? Because we have been named by other people so much that there is no sense, there's no real understanding of who they are. And so we've used literature, we've used folklore, we've used whatever expressive mechanism we had in our hands to try and understand who they are. And, and as I said yesterday, folklore has been one of the primary ways in which we try to get at these sort of fundamental questions about the character of Black people. Who are they? Are they people who are still angry about enslavement? Are they people who are angry about their poverty? Are there people who are angry about housing or whatever? But usually the focus always goes on to that whole issue of trying to define people who you don't understand. And in some ways, we need to sort of not turn the tables, but to turn the globe in such a way that we are looking at not only the other, but we're also looking at those people who have the power to define who the other is. And it's only when you begin to try to really sort of figure out, answers to those kinds of questions, are we going to kind of move in a direction where, it all becomes, we can start talking about equality and we can start talking about equity and so forth. But we have to see the whole picture. But if you're in a state of denial that there is absolutely no oppression, these things are not happening, then we're never going to get there. That's kind of a fiery moment. Okay.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions popping. There's a lot of questions and comments popping up. But I think Ricky, if she's here with us, might articulate one that would set us going again in terms of recruitment and retention and diversity in the society. Ricky, are you there? Can you mute?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay. Yeah, I guess, I really agree with John and what Marilyn had been saying about, the need to not just diversify and decolonize, but to, making the field more relevant, more attractive to everybody. But what I've also noticed among some of my mentors is that they're not coming anymore for a variety of reasons. Norm and I have been having a little off-side conversation on this, but it has to do with cost, and it has to do with their peers not coming any longer. I think for a lot of us, AFS is kind of like a big reunion every year. I had a little phone date with one of my besties last night, and it was delightful, and we both acknowledged that it's not the same doing this virtually, but at least it's something. But in terms of AFS and the regular annual meeting. Cost is a huge factor. And again, I think it's a vicious cycle of not coming, and then your friends don't come, and then so why should you come? It's not, that part of the fun isn't there anymore. But I also think that, John, Margaret, others who are on this, I can't really see everybody, but, there's people who've retired who have a whole lot to offer and who perhaps really would like to offer it. But I think as an American society as a whole, people get shunted to the side, and it's sort of assumed that, oh, well, this is what happens. There's a falling off. And that's a real shame, because we all know why it is. We as folklorists know elders are important. So what about our own elders?
Well, some of our elders have been called to pay attention by the transactions yesterday, I think. At least I was. And that could make a difference to our showing up, I think, if we know that we want to know intergenerationally and intersectionally what there is to be found. And I guess, I don't know, I don't want to monopolize the floor here. The other thing is, I think, public folklore guys are only and ever more important in this effort, if you can even make that distinction anymore. I don't know who's effective as an academic folklorist who isn't also doing public work or at least paying attention to it. And it just seems like, we need to have very porous boundaries and practical presence across institutions, and Publorians certainly do that. Is there an elder generation of public folklorists who are not turning up, or what's going on there? Are there people to drag in?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I can't speak for them. I can't see who all is on this, but I mean, it's the people who aren't here.
Their finances, of course.
And it's about finances, and it's about time. And, I remember a conversation years ago with Joe Goodwin about how AFS, that's his people. He's never not going to come. Well, of course, he got sick and he died, and so couldn't come anymore. But I think especially his last year when he wasn't able to be here was a real tragedy for him, because this was his major community. And, those hugs in the hallways are important, but it's also the hangout time. We all know the real business goes on in the hallways late at night or over lunches or whenever you can steal the time. And those are times that I really treasure about AFS. And so, these days we're in touch with our friends in other ways. I think that, the Zoom situation has helped a lot in both in terms of field work and in terms of being in touch with people. It's so much more affordable this year for so many. But, as a field as a whole, in this kind of work that you're doing, Margaret and John and others, by, interviewing people, it's really great to find out things I never knew about John Roberts. We've maybe had a couple passing conversations because we didn't study the same things. We weren't in the same fields of folklore, and his career was, as an academic folklorist, mine has been largely as a public folklorist. But this is an amazing opportunity to get to find out more, as was yesterday's conversation with Latino authors.
So I think there's follow-up on John's panel coming up tomorrow. But also, John, what would you like to see on the program for AFS next year? Throw some, let's just put you on the spot. Who would you like to see? What would you like to see done? How can we build that? I guess this is a bald attempt to get you to come back because you will have said something you wanted to do.
Well, I'd come back anyway, but I think one of the things that, the people were talking, it just seems kind of interesting to me that this format has been so good in bringing people to get back who have not been coming before. And it might be interesting to try and figure out how to integrate the regular meeting format and the kind of Zoom, so that if somebody of our generation wants to be a part of the meeting, but not to travel to it, you would have an option for doing this. But I think we really need we could figure out how to use technology in the context of the meeting. It would be wonderful. I would certainly tune in for sessions that I had an interest in, and opportunities like this where we get to talk to each other openly. So, I mean, that's an idea.
Yeah, that hybrid meeting thing, I'd love to see a big screen in the hall that has the faces of all the people attending on Zoom, you know, in their chat and whatever. I guess I'd like to see, this is nice of me to suggest to the people who busted their butts to make this meeting happen. But it just seems like some kind of hybrid that would allow strong virtual presence as well as physical presence would be great. And maybe that would change the content of the program too. We'd be doing more stuff, different stuff.
Sounds good.
We've had 2 questions come up in the chat, both Marcia's and Wanda's. I don't know who wants to go first. How about Marcia? Would you give your question?
Okay, I'm challenged technologically, so I'm sorry. Finally, I figured out how to send a question in chat. So I guess this is a generational thing. But my question, John, we have some really, to me, amazing young African-American leaders. I mean, too many to name, but just thinking of, Todd Lawrence, Wanda Addison, so many others who I see just bringing so much to the society. What advice would you give them, going forward in their leadership roles in the society?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think one of the things that I guess it took me a while to figure it out, because I kind of, fell into sort of administrative leadership kinds of roles as I was coming along. And one of the things I had to figure out is the importance of having an agenda, understanding that the role does not define what you do, you define what you do in the role. And that was something that it took me a bit of a time to figure out how to do. But I think that if you know you are interested in leadership, you're interested in administration, that the agenda is not defined by that role, you define that agenda. And it's easy to just get into a role and to sort of follow what has been done in the past and not think about innovation, not to think about the goals that you would like, things that you've always wanted to change. You can't always use a role to do that, but oftentimes you can make movement toward making changes that will move the organization forward, whether it's a college or whether it's a society. And I think that that's the best advice I could give. Leadership is not a passive role, is what I'm trying to say. Administration is not a passive role. And people who take them as being passive, that somehow they've already been defined and you're simply going to do what has been done in the past, you're probably not going to be a very memorable holder of that position.
Yeah, there's that weird tension between the culture, the microculture of the dean's offices, and this is just an example, in the larger culture of the institution or the culture beyond, that you as a dean are kind of a connector, not sequestered, but really betwixt and between all those constituencies and all those cultures, a crude word, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Roz. Who else was waiting in line there that you called on?
I think Wanda was next.
Good. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. There was a question that came up that we didn't really get a chance to dive into yesterday in the candidates forum, and it was about how, for that person who posed the point, that one of the reasons why they got into folklore because it was apolitical. And the concern that I got from that point that was raised, and it's one that I'd heard before, was that now that we're shifting to all of this politics, it makes that person, the person feel whatever they're feeling, unsure, uncomfortable, whatever it might be. And so for me, that struck me, and it continues to and has for a while, because folklore has never been apolitical to me. I don't see how any field can really be apolitical, especially when you're dealing with people. But also, I don't see literature, which is my other field. I don't see that as apolitical either. And so part of what I'm interested in is your thoughts on this point as a whole, but also how can we begin to gauge that point with our fellow folklorists who are struggling with what some of the changes are looking forward with the society?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with you that folklore has never been apolitical. We may not have acknowledged the politics that influenced even the study of folklore in the first place. I mean, I don't know who I read who had this line that it might have been even me, that even some of the origins of folklore in Europe, that the impetus for studying folklore in Europe was for the elite classes to define their other, which is a very political act. I mean, you start to think about it. And certainly one of the points I was trying to make yesterday was that Newell's work ended in certainly a very political stance. People just haven't recognized it because they really haven't looked at it in terms through a lens that would allow for the politics of it to emerge. I mean, he was working at a particular time and he set up a very politically charged paradigm for the study of folklore without really realizing it, I think, what he was doing. Because he, like most academics studying in the humanities, tried to keep it apolitical. There's a line in his essay in 1888 that always struck me until I was working on this, that kind of had a whole different sort of revelation about what he was trying to do. It says, for good or ill, and speaking about African Americans, they have become an indissoluble part of the body politic. And that was exactly one of the reasons why he felt the need to include them in his paradigm for the study of American folklore, was because they now became a part of the political apparatus of the country. And so, yeah, folklore has always been political. And I think without a more engaged political approach in what we're doing, we are going to become kind of obsolete, because we're at a point, I think, in our history where if we're going to make changes, it's going to be because we actively sort of agitate for them or advocate for them. And as academics, what do we have to advocate with? It's our scholarship, it's our teaching, it's our attempt to reach people and provide relevance to things that may seem particularly irrelevant to them. And I think for a lot of young people, especially, folklore as traditionally construed seems pretty irrelevant. And it's how we approach it that is going to bring some relevance to it. You know, when I talk about speaking racism and trying to situate it within the context of what we do, I think that this is something that will attract young people who are trying to figure out exactly what does race mean in our society at this time? What does it mean in different contexts in which we are studying, in which we're living, and so forth? And so I think that, you know, that if we don't start trying to figure out how to be political, to not be political, but to make our field more politically engaged with what is going on, that we are not going to achieve these goals of equity and equality. We're not going to be able to make ourselves interesting enough for individuals from marginalized groups to want to come in and play with us.
It's been a full.
Yeah.
Ross, do you have anybody? I can only see part of the chats here for some reason. I can only see 5 or 6 of the latest ones, which have been, among other things, reinforcing the idea of a hybrid meeting format, if we can rig it up. But what else did you see in that list? Did you see the whole list?
Yes, we've had some conversation about the hybrid meetings, about the political nature of folklore, of course, and the political nature of leadership roles. I would say these are mostly comments rather than questions, but all very relevant. I don't see any direct questions. I see Lisa.
Yeah, I guess this is just more of an observation. Just as we're seeing that you cannot be neutral today in our current political situation, that's got to sink into what we're doing as folklorists and everywhere else in our lives, inside and outside the society. If we're going to make change, we have to do our part wherever that is. In our own communities, whether we're, I'm talking about our white communities and how difficult that is to do, but we have to have the courage to do it. Otherwise, what the hell are we doing? I'm sorry.
I was thinking about what to me is really stunning, hard to understand, is the denial of structural racism. People who can say, that's not us, we're not racist. I mean, ought we to be studying the culture of deniability? I mean, how do you start dislodging that kind of position in a useful, socially engaged way? I mean, it seems it's one of those things where you either get it and you can't help it, or you're in some kind of denial. And how could we work on the denial side to change it, to loosen it? I don't know, panel on denying deniability.
It's a tough question. Patricia has a question would like to make a comment that might be helpful.
Well, sorry, I have an impression from working on the book that's just come out of essays or histories of the different folklore graduate programs, and some things that that Charles Briggs has reminded us about American Paredes, who Ricky and I both got to study with him at Texas, and so my impression, and then I'd love to hear your impression from having been involved at Penn and Ohio State, is that at Texas in the 80s and 70s, Professor Paredes always told us right out, and everybody else had been influenced by him, that of course folklore was political, that sometimes it was trivial or purely personal, but that very often folklore was the culture that people had to maintain for themselves or wanted to maintain for themselves because the powers that be had not institutionalized it or validated it or brought it up. And now that I'm looking at sort of comparative things, I'm remembering that this is the same period when, Indiana is, Dorson's kind of doing his thing to try and solidify and make a field. And the people at Penn are really leading in new field work, and really thinking about how to work equitably and collaboratively. But sort of that was Texas's piece of the puzzle, and other schools had other pieces too. But that in part because after Dick and Beverly went to Indiana, the independence of the independent Texas program kind of folded. And the other little piece just to say, and I would love to get Charles Briggs to tell us more about this, but he said that there was a point in the 60s maybe, when Paredes actually called a meeting and invited a lot of people to come and talk about this idea, and that basically nobody came. So that, you know, if we're rewriting or reimagining the field, it's like, what if we could, what would have happened if people had taken that seriously, you know, 50 years ago? So anyway, but I wondered, I mean, that's an impression that I've formed from my particular trajectory in the field. But how does that fit with your sense of what was going on at different schools where you were studying and teaching? And
well, my sense was that the schools were very different in their orientation. I don't really have a good sense of what was happening at some of the other schools. I know Penn was considered to be the theory school. Indiana was considered to be the area studies kind of approach, and Texas, I recall, did have more of a political bent, and it was probably because of your mentor and the work that he was doing. But I would just say in terms of all of that, I think that for most African Americans and other ethnic and racial groups other than European Americans, folklore has always been political. I never thought of it as being anything else, because what was interesting to me was when I got into the field was the way that at least some scholars position African American folklore as a political response to their treatment in the society. I probably never would have been attractive if that possibility had not been laid out there as to what we were trying to do. That we were trying to talk about how African Americans had used, their traditions to comment on their situation. And the situation was always political. We were always politically defined, from 3/5 of a person, and so forth. It was always that way. And I think that certainly with my work is one of the things I've always tried to talk about and tried to use, my scholarship to talk about not only the cultural, but also the political struggle, because the cultural and the political sort of gets intertwined in some of those discussions. But, I think that what we're talking about, what I'm thinking now is that what we need to do is to make sure that the field itself realize that we are at a time where political engagement is not the exception. It is what people are doing in order to try and finally achieve the goals of America, which is about equality and about equity. And the folklore has a real important role can play a very important role in that. But one of the things that we have to figure out is how to stop being silent and how to break the silence and begin to talk about those things that are real and those things that really impact where we are. And one of the things I have a really strange interest, this sort of racial and ethnic relationships is one of the things that we've had a very difficult time engaging. And one of the things I'm really interested in is to start to begin to think about how do we study folklore, not only within, but between groups, because that is the dynamic. We've been so focused on, studying folklore within groups, and sometimes, obviously, the more politically engaged actually bring into the between aspect as well. Because it's kind of hard to talk about African Americans without talking about white Americans in one way or another, and so forth. But I think that the 60s was a time when the environment in which we lived called for a more political stance. And I think there were people who rose up and who did that. And I think we're there again in a very interesting way. And I think it's a more cerebral way. And I think that people are willing to listen in a way that they have not been in the past, simply because of what we've gone through in recent years.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about the political, apolitical. My brain was going in several different historical veins. A part of the allergy to politics that I think people like Dorson seemed to operate with had to do with the Nazification of folklore in Europe, and how, how do we, or for that matter, in his case, the red side of American folklore, that in the 50s and into the early 60s, there was this attempt to depoliticize what had already been extremely political. And my own experience with a very, what can I say, tangential folklore scene at Harvard was that Albert Lord was probably following his mentor, Milman Parry, in studying Balkan epic without ever discussing the politics of it. Balkans, and reading And Other Neighborly Names on my way to Afghanistan was exactly what I needed to do to get the Texas point. And it was very much available, but it wasn't on the syllabus where I studied. And it was like people were scared of politics. There is a backstory there that's personal that I won't go into, not my story, but Albert Lord's, that there may have been reasons for him to be allergic to politics at Harvard, but it's that allergy to overt political expression is another, I guess it's another form of denial that we could be looking at as such, not only trying to correct it, but trying to figure out, why it operates the way it operates.
Margaret. Oh, go ahead, John. But I also wanted to draw attention that Eric Morales has a question next.
Oh,
let's do that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't have a question. I was just commenting in the chat that if we change the way we define folklore, it might open up to a lot of this creativity, because if we're looking at only genres, we're going to be locked into it. But when I see folklore in impoverished communities, I see resourceful creativity. I see that folklore is the one thing you can never take away, which is why it is such a core of activist movements. You always go to the folk chants during the Chicano movement. They put on plays, they wrote songs. You can never take away the folklore, because at its base of it, it's resourceful. But I was writing that in the chat and I didn't have a question, sorry.
Do you want to respond to that? And then I think, does Phyllis have a question? Did you have your hand up also, Phyllis? But John might want to respond to that comment too.
Which comment?
Eric's comment. I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about that. I didn't want to cut off that conversation.
No, I don't have a question.
Okay.
Hi, Phyllis.
We've got John now. Oh, Phyllis, are you back with us? Do you want to say something? Or was that just saying hello?
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm good.
I'm really grateful that you that you came back to this meeting and you said the things that you said yesterday. The comment that I had wanted to say earlier was speaking to Margaret's question about denial, and our anti-racist analysis really talks about the power of socialization of us all, and unpacking what that really means for us as folklorists, and what it means for whiteness as well as Blackness would be, I think, an interesting way to begin to think about that deniability that you're talking about. How have we been socialized to deny? How have we been socialized to be complicit in certain ways of viewing the world? I think Prahlad talked about that a little bit in his paper yesterday too.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think a lot of times with African Americans, even in our attempts to socialize our youth about racism and its manifestations, we're at the same time creating a kind of denial, because one of the things that we're really telling them, don't take it as racism, when we're actually saying this is racism, but you can't take it that way. You can't respond to it in that way, especially when we're dealing with authority and so forth. way we talk to our children about in encounters with the police, which is something that you're hearing a lot about now, that Black children have always been socialized to understand what an encounter with a police officer means. But at the same time, she's like, well, don't do anything. It's almost like they can do whatever they want to us, but we must deny it as police brutality. We must deny this, all of those kinds of things. So there's sort of a culture of denial. I think you're absolutely right about that. But then there's the other kind of denial that just denied the existence of racism at all. And there are only certain people in the society who have the luxury of doing that. If you're Black, that's a luxury that you really don't possess.
Right, right.
So I'm kind of worried about the people who aspire to be able to be denying that, and whether we could short circuit that aspiration, make them a little, well, that's not the right thing for folklore to say. We got to make them think. I mean, how do you deal with the population that is aspiring to invulnerability? Let's put it that way. I'm thinking about white, Proud Boys or whoever, one of some of the harder cases.
I think you have to disrupt what they think they know.
Yeah.
And what they think they understand.
Absolutely.
We talked a little bit about that in the local learning session earlier this morning. That disrupting that and then instilling a different worldview is part of ending deniability, or at least interrupting it.
Yeah. Can I put a plug in for your article in the forthcoming volume with the Indiana Futures of Folklore thing? Because you were talking about how to do that, actually. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a lively conversation happening in chat with Eric Miller, and perhaps it's best to invite Eric to come and make the comment here so that John can respond to that. Eric, would you be willing to do that?
Well, yes. Excuse me that I'm lying down. I'm trying to be hopeful, but of course, in academia, the humanities are dwindling. Student debt is tremendous. There are almost no teaching jobs. The senior generation, we love you, but you're the last ones who are ever going to have a job around here. All the younger people are, adjunct. So it seems it's running off into a ditch. Please tell me otherwise.
Wow. From my point of view, I hope it's not running off into a ditch. I understand that the shrinking factor professorate is it's certainly something that's been going on for a while. And it's very difficult to be optimistic about an opening up of the job market, especially given where we are right now with the pandemic and everything. It's sort of like we're going to come out into a new world, and who knows what the new world is going to look like. We're not going to go back to something called normal that people think of as normal. And perhaps in that world, things will be better, but it's kind of difficult. I don't know. I think you still try to commit yourself to doing the kind of work that you think is important, whether you are an adjunct or whether you are a tenured professor. And if this kind of work is interesting and valuable to you, hopefully you will find a way to do it.
Yes, thank you.
We got. I'm just looking at chats here. I'm a slow reader. Anybody else want to jump in at this point that we haven't heard from? Hands up. I'm not seeing everybody's hand either. There's a bunch of people here. Mostly not faces. Jessica, can you see whether there's people here that could be called on?
I'll just jump in. I just want to thank John for coming and for this and for yesterday and for saying that you're going to come back in Harrisburg. We've missed you. And I also want to thank you for when you were at Ohio State and the way that I was almost there. Thanks to some efforts that it just didn't work out, but I'm so glad that you were there and the work you were doing there. We can still see the difference in faculty that are still there that came through that initiative, especially for the Latinx community. So thank you so much for that work. And of course, for your academic work as well, not just your leadership in administration in universities. And often we are pitted against each other, administration versus faculty. But with you, and I think Valerie and others, I think there was a sense, at least for me, that wasn't the case there. So that made me feel really good about the work you were doing. And it's a tough road to hoe because you're kind of you have to do budget cuts, for example. At the same time, you want to preserve the integrity of the work. And so there's that tug. And having been an administrator, I know how difficult it is, but also how rewarding it can be. And I'm sure you will agree with me that often after you're gone, it gets dismantled or changed and somebody else comes. And that was a tough lesson for me to learn. When you step away and then somebody else comes along and your vision got only so far and then it's somebody else's. And I think we need to do perhaps a leadership seminar or leadership something for the faculty, but also I think it functions the same way. Organizations and institutions have the same mechanisms. So even in the public sector, when you're in a state arts agency, there's particular leadership traits that I think folklorists bring to that job. And I love the quote about the role does not define you, you define the role. I think that's so true. So thank you. I just wanted to say thank you. There's no question here.
Well, thank you.
That's, to me, a lovely exit line. I think we can all be very grateful to John and for the time and thought he's given us.
We do have one more question in the chat, and there may be others, but Nate Gibson is here with us and wants to ask a question about researching white supremacy. Nate, are you here?
I am, thanks. I just had a question for John. It seemed yesterday to me in the talk that there was a sort of call out for more folklorists who were white to explore the sort of racism and white supremacy that's upheld. But I think a lot of folklorists, myself included, struggle with this idea to want to be an advocate and to bring attention to the injustices, but also working with a community for a year or more as you're working on a dissertation is kind of tough if that group is the Proud Boys or working with white supremacist groups or the Klan or groups like that. So how would you, from my own personal experience of my dissertation was on the Confederate flag and some of the racism in the American roots music scene in Europe, and how that's a difficult thing for me to write about because that's not the group of people I want to be advocating for, but I'm trying to explain how those feelings and those, how that racism is supported and continued in that scene. So I guess I would just look for suggestions on how to be researching some of these racism issues and also being an advocate, but not necessarily for the group that you're working with.
Well, I think it would be how you look at advocacy. I would certainly not recommend, infiltrating or necessarily studying groups like the Ku Klux Klan, et cetera, unless you had some sort of natural end there where you would not put yourself in danger. That doesn't make a lot of sense. The kind of work that you're doing to me seems very valuable, where you're really trying to understand this kind of racism. And it is a kind of advocacy. the more we understand about racism, and it's one of those things that we talk about. I said yesterday about the invisibility of systemic racism. Most racism is invisible. We don't see it because people no longer come out and call you the N-word. They no longer do things that are overtly oppressive, etc. But there are still ways and manifestations of racism that we really don't understand, but they're just as harmful in the long run because of the way in which they reinforce and ideas that have always been there. And I think the more we can understand about that, because I think a lot of people still do not understand the problem of the Confederate flag at all. I mean, it's just like, it's a flag, it's a piece of cloth. Why people get so upset about it? But it's more than that. And if we can do the kind of work that exposes the significance behind that for the people who are devoted to using it in racist ways, I think that that's very valuable. It certainly is advocating for me. I don't have to try and explain to something to people that I don't fully understand myself, but because you've done the work, you understand it. And you can articulate that in a way that I never could. And in a way that is valuable work in and of itself. And I'm glad to hear that you're doing that. What's the name of your book?
The dissertation was on performing, what was it called? Performing America and Rebelling in Finland. And so it was about the whole American roots music community in Finland.
Okay.
But I just sort of, it's difficult to take on these types of projects in which you're writing about people you disagree with at a core level. And I'm just curious about how moving forward as sort of a call out from the Folklore Society to do more research of this nature of white supremacy and of racism, how folks can go about those projects safely. And as you mentioned, it's kind of difficult to infiltrate groups that might be dangerous.
Yeah. Well, you're experiencing this white fragility. You need to get over it and call out people who need to be called out. That's certainly what I do in my work. I don't have a problem in talking about things the way I talk about them, because I think that it's important that people understand them in the most direct terms possible. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else lurking in chat that we haven't heard from? Jessica, are you seeing anybody there? Oh, Jessica's still with us.
I am here. I am here on the bridge of this ship starting another session now. So we should probably thank everybody and move on. But I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat now, but I hope this conversation continues.
I just want to say thank you very, very much to John and to Marcia and to the oral history mafia in AFS. That it really has, I think this has been a very rich moment for me, and I hope for the rest of you as well. So thank you. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Margaret.